Abhinav, what about you?
I think I already more or less spoke about this. Yeah, I think it's totally dependent on how well they're bearing the sanctions right now in terms of the real figures, which we don't know. So I'm actually going to wait for some of the actual evidence to come in before really making a point about this, because who honestly knows? One of the big doubts is technology. Um, the Western media has been talking a lot about the Russians looting refrigerators for chips. I think it's overblown, but who really knows what technology is missing and how severely it's impacting the manufacturing flow of Russian industry. And honestly, it's one thing to say that we lack commodities because they're required as a raw material, but the reason the West is so successful in the last 200 years is because of their monopolization of technology. It's really through intellectual property rights that they're making the money. Essentially, the Western companies control the rights to the technology. For example, aircraft production, it's totally owned by the West. So if you're a third world country, you have to buy a plane from Boeing. Otherwise, you cannot fly. It's not as if you can manufacturing in house, because it takes an immense amount of capital, capex, basically, to do that kind of stuff. So, if you look at how much technology one has to purchase from the West to survive in the modern world, you basically get bankrupted, and you have to basically rely on debt. And the debt also you get from the West again from that. Now, Russia, by creating an alternative financial system, that I think could be a game changer. That really will see, because the decline of SWIFT and de-dollarization is actually critical to this entire thing. If a lot of that money goes away from the dollar to other currencies, then we can see this thing change, and then capital expenditure could flow to the Asian economies instead of the other way around.
Yeah,
I
I want
would
to push back on that statement that you said that the West was is successful in the last 20 years because of technology. I think you are only seeing the half of the picture. The West is economically very successful in the last after World War II, because it basically colonized the rest of the world. It's absorbing all the raw materials from the rest of the world into its relatively smaller economies at the time, and then using that those resources that is obtained to then uh, build out and invest in technological advances. So you're only looking the technological advances would not have been created there if it had not done all the colonization. So if you wanna take a one view of it is that this is great for the world, because if we had all just if colonization never happened, everybody would still be in like pre-industrialization age,
Well,
because
so my counter argument, which I don't really disagree with you, but the point is they were able to colonize the rest of the world because of technology.
yeah,
The
yes, they were the first.
I mean,
Yeah, yeah,
not
true.
not just technology, the military tactics were also
Yes.
superior, but that's
Technology
also
and
where
general
that's
maintenance.
Yeah, yeah. Well, the Chinese had gunpowder 1,000 years before the Europeans had, and instead of using the gunpowder to shoot people with cannons and guns, they used the gunpowder to make fireworks to make people laugh and be happy about it. So they had the technology, they just didn't bother to go kill the Western people or the people around them. It's both availability of technology and what you want to do with it. And the Western Europeans decided to conquer half the world with it. Yeah.
I would like to address one important point that Abhinav made. So a Bloomberg report literally came out 10 hours ago today, and basically it says that Russia is importing more microchips, even though there are sanctions, more microchips than before the war started. So, and the way that reports stated is that they're getting it from China. They're getting it from UAE and the third country, Turkey. And again, that brings me back to the same question. And this time I'll hand it to you, Wyatt. Do you think that by relying on all of these countries, do you think Russia is losing its economic sovereignty?
I don't think so. At least I'm not even sure. How do you put economic sovereignty? Like
Um, uh,
everybody have to trade. Everybody have to trade to get something that they don't have, and the the only country that I know of that maybe one or two is United States, that they like seems like they don't really want to trade. They only want the money to flow into their country. The other one is China, which is trying their best to become absolutely independent. Like they have everything. They don't need import. They just want to export. China is the only other country that is actively working towards this ultimate independence, economic independence, which is actually disastrous for the whole world if they achieved it, because that would be just like the British Empire's opium situation, where they just want you to buy from them, but they will buy nothing from you. They kind of like the opium war actually happened because China was self-sufficient. They don't need any import, and and the British need to buy the tea, but then this trade imbalance, they can't take it. It's like it's the wealth just go into China, go into Qing dynasty or Ming dynasty, and they cannot accept that, which is why they started to they need to sell something to China so that they can have this trade balance. Thus is opium. They imported opium, they get them addicted. That's where they can have the trade balance so that they can buy tea. So so trade, I feel that is absolutely important. You cannot have a country that absolutely don't need to trade. Like what China is trying to achieve now is just going to bring disaster to them, but it's very hard for them to reach there, because it's literally not possible to reach there. Because during Qing dynasty days, you don't need diesel, you don't need oil, you don't need gas. Now you need, and they don't have it. So luckily we still have that kind of safety in that sense. But in terms of Russia, they can possibly reach that point, just like what United States is now. They can literally don't trade. United States can literally don't trade. They just export. They can don't import anything. United States have that power. Russia have the potential for that, but tentatively not there. So but because they have that potential, that's why I'm quite bullish about Russia, because they have a lot of pathway they can take. Whether they can reach there is another story, because of course there's a lot of competition. China will definitely not want Russia to have an industrial, manufacturing base that can threaten them. Which is why I said, if after the Ukraine war ended, the geopolitical scene will change again, and then you will see India working closer with Russia to to have some kind of a pact, the pushback against the Chinese growing influence, because definitely China's influence is going to get stronger and stronger because of manufacturing, because of the tie up with Russia and BRICS. So China will become very, very powerful. In fact, it's already getting powerful by the minute. So, and Russia is definitely aware of that. So if the Ukraine war just finish, Russia next target will be to suppress China, for sure. That's how I look at the situation. Uh I don't think Russia would allow China to overtake Russia um in terms of power and influence. Tentatively they are almost on par. Russia to me is always still like the big brother. But I feel like the 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 fact that there is this geopolitical competition, Russia will definitely do something to make sure that um, they will be relevant, coming to the future. Yeah, Drew,
Yeah. Yes, I would like to push back on, of course,
of course.
the bit you said about China. No, China isn't trying to be self-sufficient, and it isn't trying. It that's the whole point of Belt and Road. It's trying to get resources from other countries to trade those resources, get them into China. You don't have a Belt and Road initiative if you're trying to be self-sufficient. It's trying to build a system of allies and then trade with these allies to get the resources. That's not self-sufficiency. That's a system of allies to trade. Yeah. So it's actually
Yeah.
the opposite.
Well, but
Whereas
what will
you're
happen
right,
is that,
Russia can be self-sufficient, and what I think is self-sufficient right now, if it's not in the war. So
Yeah.
they don't really need, other than like chips and whatnot,
no, but they
which people
still
don't really
import
need
a
to
lot of
survive.
things. So they
Yeah.
still import like consumer goods and everything. So the thing is in China,
Yeah, but it's not something you need to survive.
yeah. So
If
it's
all
just
the
that what I'm
basic
trying to say
stuff.
about China is that they don't need to import any consumer stuff. If literally
No,
almost no
China
need.
needs to import food and
But food
fertilizer,
is not
and
consumer stuff. Like food, what they don't
yeah, but
have
they
is
need it to survive.
the raw stuff. The raw stuff they don't have. Oil, food,
Yeah,
meat,
yeah, exactly. So
gas.
they'll never get
But
that.
it's
They'll
always the low
never be
level stuff,
self-sufficient.
the cheap stuff, the low level stuff.
Yeah.
You can't earn China's money because you need to sell secondary, tertiary products to a country to take the money out. It's very hard because China have most of the things, not everything, but they have most of the thing, which is why
Yeah, they make their own stuff.
it's almost any country is going to have a trade imbalance with China. It's very very hard to have a trade balance with China, so that's why it's scary. Russia have the potential to do it, but it's just that whether they will achieve it, that's another story altogether.
So
So
I just
I can
want
answer that question because regarding the would Russia be able to remain sovereign? Because if I remember the question correctly, the issue was if Russia would be able to remain sovereign vis-a-vis China, actually, in this regard. Now, I want to forward 2 points here. One of this relates to the technological facet, which you all guys discussed. And I'm not going to be disagreeing or anything. Actually, to a large extent, I think you're true, but I think there's some nuances worth pointing out. When it comes to the refrigerator pieces and whatever, you don't need advanced microchips for running missiles or anything like that. And China has the ability to produce the microchips that Russia can use in that regard. And China's issue here is that their microchip abilities they don't make for the most optimal smaller electronics, because that's where you really need the smaller chips like cell phones and stuff like that. So they will be a little bit subpar but still usable. And this is what the Americans were referring to, technological gap. Now, you guys are also mentioning a little bit. I want to just add this quick. The thing with technology here, and China is a prime example, is that they took in and then they reversed engineered to a large extent. So it's not like a straightforward, they need to do technological development from scratch. There are many ways they can go about it. So over time, it is not inconceivable that China would be able to maybe strike a deal with South Korea and thus be able to make the microchips advance enough for competing truly with the Americans. But also, the Russians are developing as well, so they might catch up to at least get the lower part. So they might be the cheaper ones. When the Chinese start to ascending in price and quality, the Russians might take over the cheaper markets there. And that kind of keep them going. So that was just one point. You can disagree with it, but I want to have this other thing, and this is more a matter of economic sovereignty. I think it's worth pointing out the similarities for Russia and China in this regard, because they are very introverted, basically, and their internal interests don't necessarily conflict so much. Like China has little reason to really go colonize or do anything like that. Over like this thing, but I've heard people say that China will want to colonize, settle in eastern Russia, which I think is pretty ridiculous because they're having a population crash coming on around the corner, right? So they don't have any expansionist policies because they might not simply be capable of doing so. And so I don't think they will be a threat to Russia in that regard. I don't think also, and this is also important, I don't think they will be able to subvert Russian economy as what happened under Yeltsin, for example, or any other. Like if that type of coercion occurs, it will be over a long period of time for two reasons. Actually, and it's for the same reason that China is not likely to be subverted in the same manner. Xi Jinping had made this anti-corruption moves and so forth, taking down oligarchs and consolidating the elite within the power structure that is China. And Putin has done very much the same. Last year, 30 Russian oligarchs were wiped out. Even pro-Russian sources kind of are willing to concede it's very likely because of missed reasons. Now, most of these oligarchs were also outside of Russia. They had their assets frozen and taken, and so forth. So, like the Russian ruling elite and the financial elite there are much more much more consolidated in a manner that makes them not so susceptible to subversion from either China, US, or what have you, and like vice versa. So I don't think it's going to be China may very well want to try to kind of botch some of the Russians' approaches to industrialize and get increase their market and compete thereof. But I don't think that either side are in the position to really take over each other, remove sovereignty. I think they're both are very much going to be, in that sense, very sovereign. So yeah, I'm not sure if they're going to get any pushback for this, but that's my
So
points.
just a quick point on this. I think one major risk of isolationism, which happened to Japan when they went isolationist for almost 2 centuries, um, is that they actually had rifles at the beginning of the period, and so they were competitive. But if you look at when the American ships basically said, "You either open up or we fire on you," and they did fire. They realized they were hopelessly outclassed, and so because you're in your own bubble, you can survive. But unless there's technology transfer, technology doesn't advance. So that's why we have all of these research papers. For example, you there's a Chinese university which does something, somebody in Korea picks it up, does something else, then somebody goes, doesn't share, makes it proprietary, then it leaks through the black market. I mean, if we really look at how Pakistan first acquired its nukes, it got it from China. um, the Chinese maybe got it from the Russians, who knows? But we know that North Koreans got it from the Pakistanis. So if that can happen with nukes, I mean, everything else, it's basically technology transfer. Now, the problem is if you cut off the Russians from all technology transfer, that's a big risk. So really, they can be sovereign to an extent, but they still would have to trade technology and information with the Chinese, and hopefully the Indians too would be doing enough research, and any other countries which, because if there's no information, really this age is about information. If there's no information because everybody hates you, then there's a problem. So right now, most of the world is actually neutral, so the Russians don't have it so bad. But if most of the cutting edge work is being done in the West, then there is a problem for Russia.
But when you're saying,
I don't.
just to clarify, if when you're saying technological insulate, like they're being isolated, are you talking about Russia and China? Because I can also see the Chinese having profit incentives enough to kind of, at least in some sectors, be helping or cooperating, I should say, with the Russians in that development, and maybe in exchange for military technology. Because as far as I get it, China is somewhat ahead of Russia, but then in some other respects they are not. So I don't think there will be. I find it a little bit unlikely that Russia would all of a sudden, especially considering the geopolitical environment generally, with so much support for Russia. I find it a little bit hard. I don't think even China would want to, make a fallout necessarily by trying to isolate Russia, because there are so many things going for them that are mutually beneficial. That this idea of kind of no, we don't want you to be technologically developing because you may pose a threat to us. I mean, Russia doesn't really pose a threat to China, anyways. And again, they're both very introverted countries. They really don't want to be having too much meddling with each other. They want their orbit in control, right? So like China would have a lot of interest in North Korea, Japan, South Korea, Philippines, Singapore, I would assume as well. But they, the same way as Russia would have their interest regarding Ukraine, the Baltics, Belarus. But beyond that, I don't find them to be having like the same kind of there's like you do as we say or we cut you off. Because in this instant, cutting you off basically means opening the door for the West to come in again. Huh?
I don't think
So
I don't wait. I don't think we're talking about they want to isolate. I think we're saying they can. It's a entirely different thing.
Right, I
Russia,
got that too, but I find it like extremely unlikely for the reasons I mentioned. That was basically
yeah,
why.
and I think we're all in agreement. We're not saying they want to.
So I
No,
agree
I
with
wasn't saying
a lot of
isolationist.
points.
I was talking them forming a bloc and not trading with the West. I didn't mean isolationist as in Russia alone. And it really can't happen, as Drew was also pointing out.
So I agree with a lot of points that Coping just made, and I think Wyatt also um, said some very interesting points regarding to this. The thing about what I meant when I said economic sovereignty is like you know how a lot of markets that are available in Russia now are being taken over by some Chinese companies, some Indian companies, and that basically gives them a position of influence in within the Russian market. And let's say tomorrow, I don't see this happening within the next 20-30 years, but if down the line Russia and China do compete for their sphere of influence, which would be in the Central Asia, then could it be possible that China has um, a bigger influence over Russia? And I think what mentioned that I don't think Russia will let China have that power over them, and I kind of agree to that, and I think it's more of a balanced relationship because China doesn't have resources, Russia does, but Russia doesn't have technology, China does, and so I think that's one way that the relationship is balanced as of now. What happens in the future is anyone's guess. And this brings me to the last question of today is what happens if this war keeps on going until one or the either collapses? So either Ukraine or Russia collapses. And I'm not gonna go ahead and say that Russia's gonna survive. I'm not gonna say that Ukraine's gonna survive. I would like you guys to kind of make a little speculative prediction about what happens if Russia survives and what happens if Ukraine is the last one standing. So I'll start with Drew.
Uh, well, if this is a forever war, basically Ukraine's men just continue dying, and there's no semblance of any economy now in Ukraine. Uh, so I heard some interviews that all they've got is more or less is like hobby economy, like like Uber Eats and Grab and all those kind of things, but not really any kind of real economy going. So that Ukraine just goes into stasis mode. They Russia, you know, it's a I would call it small, but kind of like a medium-sized conflict on its border. But if you look at all the YouTube videos of Russians living day-to-day lives, they don't seem to be very affected by the conflict. So Russia will just continue being Russian, doing all Russian things. It's the overall economy is not really that affected, other than the sanctions. But the sanctions have already kind of grown to live with the sanctions. It's not like there's much more else that the West can pull in terms of sanctions to drastically hurt the Russian economy that much more, unless something large geopolitically changes, like either India or China suddenly becomes very pro-West and implement sanctions themselves, then that'll be a big problem. But in a forever war, with the current status, Russia's fine.
Do you think Russia could collapse if they lose?
If they I if Ukraine loses, Ukraine might just not be a thing anymore. It might just cease to exist, or it will be a rump state or whatever. Russia, if it loses, and I define lose by in terms of Russia losing the four new provinces which it annexed, which if it comes to that, I think they might still not nuke anyone. But if anybody tries to take Crimea, I think they would throw the nukes. So that's just impossible to happen, because if that happens, we're all dead anyway. So no point discussing. So in the case where they lose those four, then they would have a catastrophic number of dead, fighting age men. So I think, from what I understand of the Russian economy, that would be a huge, any economy, if you lose a vast majority of your men, that's they'll just be colonized and broken up. They'll be balkanized, and then the West will come in with all its corporations and start to basically sap Russia of its natural resources. They would then use Russia's industry, go find out where all those weapons factories are, incorporate those into the whole Western industry, and start churning out more weapons, but this time in Western calibers, and then prepare for the next war with China. That's so if Russia loses, China's next. There's no two ways about it.
Toby.
Yeah, I think okay, we'll play the game where, like, I think Ukraine's already done, but I could be wrong. I see on the internet that they're killing 7 soldiers for every one that they lose. So let's just say they're killing 70 for every one that they lose, and Ukraine prevails. Well, Russia's internal politics ranges from the completely psychotic to the moderately psychotic, in terms of patriotism. What happens to their nuclear power? What happens to their nuclear weapons when Russia breaks up and fractures internally? The world is rolling the dice there. I think that, if the world's very lucky, then London survives and doesn't get nuked. Tel Aviv survives and doesn't get nuked. Berlin survives and doesn't get nuked. So that's, that could happen. Alternatively, you could get some real psychos decide that it's time to throw down, and then we have nuclear conflict. I don't agree with Drew. I think he's overstating the situation. I think there could be a limited nuclear exchange, and it would be catastrophic, but there'd be parts of the world that would survive. I think that's a remarkably likely chain of events. It's probably not worth talking about, but this is where NATO has brought us. We're contemplating a nuclear power, a really big one, with very, very hard-line elements in its political makeup, who are already calling for the use of nuclear weapons to break down. I mean, to make the point clearly, there are people in Russia now who advocate the use of nuclear weapons in Ukraine. So what does NATO do then? Ukraine's not in NATO. Do they then threaten Russia with nuclear weapons? It's a very strange situation that we're in, the idea that Russia loses. But it could be the fantasy story that someone overthrows Putin and everyone in Russia is relieved, and then Russia gives up its nukes and gets balkanized and gets broken up, and nobody wants to be Russian anymore, and they don't care about their heritage. I mean, this is if you tune into British media, this is what those folks are now believing. This is what they think is going to happen. I saw a British professor say that that's what was going to happen. Russia was going to overthrow their own government and voluntarily surrender to Ukraine. So yeah, I don't know. I don't even like talking about that. I think that I think it's just very depressing to go down that road.
It's delusional.
Yeah. It's an extremely strange situation that this is where the wise men of the West have led us through their insistence that they are the masters of the universe and that everybody else will bow down to them and that they will take whatever military action that they wish anywhere in the world, and there's nothing anybody can do about it. I mean, I think the origins of this kind of insanity were the fall of the Soviet Union, because in the 90s, America was the only global superpower. China was not a fraction of what it is now. It was still rising up. And the folks in NATO, the mask came off. If you have a look at the NATO documents in the 90s, and even up to 2018, they were still saying it. They weren't even hiding it. You know, like the neocons and the rest of it, they were going to remake the Middle East by invading 7 countries, and they were going to do whatever they want. If you have a look at the way Bill Clinton spoke to Ukraine and Russia, they kind of gave lip service to the idea that they weren't going to expand NATO, but they also kind of said that they'd do whatever they want, and Russia had to live with it. And that was kind of true at the time. So I think we're living in an age where the neocons and these people that are absolutely sure that they can do whatever they want, they're controlling our destiny to some extent. So where that goes is anybody's guess. But I would make the point that those people aren't elected. You know, the institutions that are making these decisions, Stoltenberg is not elected. They have this chain of custody through the governments of the countries that are, but increasingly the chain of command from the owners of the banks to the corporations that they own to the people in these military institutions it's leaving the countries out of it, and we see that most common in Europe, where, as I say, you know, the European countries, who cares what they think? It really doesn't matter. It's not clear how any of them could leave NATO if their people wanted to. It's not clear that the political systems in the free and democratic West even permit any politician from any party to deviate from the corporate will. So, yeah, I don't like to think about what happens if Russia loses. I mean, we can hope for the best. But as Drew says, where does that leave China? So, yeah, I think I'd avoid that question and go and do something useful, like, you know, go do some gardening or fishing or something.
What about Abhinav? Sorry.
So if we define a Russian loss as a loss of Crimea, then we are basically talking about losing access to the Baltic Sea Fleet. And basically, given how the situation is with Ukraine, having all trade blocked through that route. So that's not going to happen because that's an existential threat. So then nukes go into the picture, or you fight to the last Russian, just like you're talking about fighting to the last Ukrainian. And there would be every reason to do that. Like, that is total war. So if we instead talk about the war concluding in the Donbass with roughly the same lines as 2014, that's possible. And I honestly, I think with that, really what would happen in Russia is there would be political turmoil. Maybe there would be a regime change at the top. There would be the risk of balkanization, which again brings in a whole can of worms. So that's really the worst situation for Russia. It doesn't change the situation for the person on the street, really, to that extent. To an extent, a long war does, because the longer the war drags, the more losses there are, the more you know somebody who's died in the war. So there's that war weariness, which would creep in even in the most patriotic country. For Ukraine, on the other side, it's a matter of survival, because the longer this is, and this is really terribly sad for Ukraine, because it's essentially, it's NATO fighting with Ukrainian blood is how I look at the situation. They don't really care how many lives are lost, and they would not reconstruct this country. So the Russians are taking this wrecking ball and then using it all over the country. The Russians are also losing. But the point is, because both sides lose, I think we all agree on that. Nobody's winning this war. But the Ukrainians definitely can't win under any situation. Like, even if they kill all the Russians, they're not going to win, because ultimately they're going to get 20 billion or 30 billion in aid, with surrendering every institution to the West, and then those countries. So if you look at what happened in Afghanistan, a lot of these aid agencies, they were directly controlling how the money was flowing, and the government had no authority to do anything, because you knew that the donor companies are really running the shots. And so, and this is the same that has happened with Mozambique or any of the other countries, where aid has come in after war has torn the economy. And so what happens is the donors, and we know that US aid will run the shop. So they're going to basically control the government and undermine any person who tries to do anything there. And which means that a lot of the other forces will come in. So in Afghanistan, for example, there's this warlord thing. So alternative sources of power come in. Why? Because your main primary government is being subverted by the centers of money. So this is going to happen to Ukraine in the best case scenario. Um, it's terribly sad because it's like I don't think Ukraine deserves this. Any country deserves
Nobody
this.
does.
Wyatt, what about you?
Don't think I have much to add. Like, what kind of other scenarios can there be? I mean, my position is Russia will never lose this war. It's not possible. As neutral as I go, I'm being practical. There's no scenario that they can lose the war. This is not Vietnam War. No, this is, if Vietnam is just next to United States, United States would have never lost the Vietnam War. So the reality is Russia is not going to lose this war. It's not possible. The tide of the war on the ground clearly is on the side of Russia. Russia is winning. They are not taking ground because there's no need to, because they are just wiping out the Ukrainian forces. This is what the pro-Russians like to say. This is the reality on the ground. I don't talk much about that because no point, because my mapping is just tracking captures of the ground. But you just look at how Ukrainian government acts, you know that they are losing the war. So for Russia, let's say in the very unlikely scenario, let's say NATO enter the war with their troops, and then Russia still do nothing. Didn't expand the war, and then they just allow this to happen. Just like how they allow the mercenaries to continue to fight, and the tanks to come in. Because there's a very very high chance Putin will just do nothing, because he don't want to escalate the war. And then in that sense, then maybe Russia lose the war. Maybe they lost the four oblasts. Russia will have tremendous political turmoil within its own country, and then the West would then use this opportunity to fracture the whole country into multiple pieces, balkanize the country. So this is a massive threat, and I doubt Putin will be that dumb to not do anything in that kind of circumstances. But of course, as far as I can tell, the main battle tanks, transferring of main battle tanks and everything, I didn't really see Russia exactly try to do anything different. So who knows? But the chances of Russia losing the war is very very unlikely. And but for the Ukrainian side, they are almost destined to lose the war. Even if they win the war, they still lose the war. So there is no future for Ukraine unless they are very lucky to have a very very good leader at the end of the war. When they just get a peace, they get a very good leader, and then they revolutionize the whole country. Like what happened to Rwanda. Rwanda was it's almost like wasteland, and then suddenly now they are like the Singapore of Africa. So this, it really depends on the leadership, but then of course we never know what's going to happen. And of course, there's always the threat of Poland. There's always the threat, of all sort of shit that is going to happen on Ukraine. So, yeah, but my position is just like this. I think everyone have already said more or less why I already said as well.
Coping things, you're the last one, and then I think we can conclude the meeting here.
So I'm gonna be disagreeing with all of you. I think because I am gonna choose to believe that Ukraine can take Crimea, and I take this on a religious basis, because if I believe it to be true, it's true. So now I choose that to be the case, and you guys cannot have no argument against me. So this is what will happen. With or without NATO, Ukraine will believe themselves to take over Crimea, and the Donbass and everything. They will take it over, and at the same time, they will send special military super troops right into the Kremlin, right into the room of where Putin is, have a knife up his throat so he will not launch those nukes. And by the time it's been, it will be too difficult for the Russian administration to actually nuke. Maybe they break. Maybe it's what Toby said. Maybe it does break into a civil war and it balkanizes. And yeah, that is how Russia is gonna be taken out, and I believe that to be true. So it's true, as I said. So that's uh, that's it. And for those pro-Ukrainians who agree with me, you should definitely hit that like button and subscribe and share to everyone how supportive we are in Ukraine, not just on the neutral terms, but we also have I'm a NATO man. Like I'm not a NATO man, but I'm from a NATO country, so I can NAFO. I can NAFO, and I'll NAFO for you. As for Ukraine, I don't think Ukraine is going to be destroyed. I think it may indeed be survived. It may indeed survive, but I agree with many of it's a lot of ifs and buts here. Ukraine may very well cease to completely exist. I think there are economical incentives to keep Ukraine alive as a rump state, as a debt slave, and there may be other factors coming into play, but I do think that Ukraine does have a chance of surviving the war. This depends in part how much they are defeated. If the war goes on for 2, 3, 4 more years, it is not inconceivable that the Russians would actually be able to cut off Odessa from the rest of Ukraine and blockade it from the sea, and subsequently take it out eventually. Eventually get Odessa. Regardless, even if they just cut off Odessa from the rest of Ukraine, Ukraine is then we're talking about an existential threat, because that is pretty much all that Ukraine has left to keep it geopolitically relevant. As soon as it becomes completely landlocked, as soon as it loses that port city, then I think Ukraine stands a much higher probability of no longer existing as a state entity. Maybe somewhere around the Lvov area or something like that. But I still stand by my statement. Ukraine will go to Crimea. They will have Putin prevent any nukes, and they will turn Kyiv into the Paris of Eastern Europe. And that's all I have to say on that prediction thing. That is certainly true.
I think with that amazing answer, we'll end the panel today. I'll let Wyatt say his last piece, and thank you all for listening.
So thank you everyone for watching this DPA panel, which is economics, but we have so much geopolitics involved with this, because it's really hard to untie the two, because they are all related. And thank you, Aki, for sponsoring and organizing this panel. And thank you, Koping, Abhinav, Toby, and Drew for participating. Thank you myself for participating as well. And thank you everyone for watching. And I'll see you in the next update. Bye-bye.
Bye bye. Watch and subscribe. Press that like button.